Today we're going to be looking at the second part of the self chapter. So, primarily, we're going to be looking at two things: Goffman's view of the self in terms of dramatic performance, and then we'll get into briefly the idea of the postmodern self. So, excuse me, when looking at a recap, kind of remembering what we did in the first part of the chapter, basically we conceptualize the self. And the self can be understood as twofold, kind of the self concepts that one possesses, and of the different multiple selves you possess, but also the different ways of thinking about yourself, the different ways of thinking about other people in the world as a whole when you're in those different senses of self. So, together, the thought streams and the self concepts come together to complete the self. And the self is something that's not a product of the inside out direction. It's not innate. We're not born with it. Rather, the self is a kind of outside in direction, like we've been talking about in the last couple chapters. And it's very fluid, and the self can change in terms of its significance to you, kind of if it matters to you or not. It can disappear totally. That's what we talked about, the kind of your sense of self may be connected to being a college student. Well, that will disappear when you become a former college student. And then we recognize, in addition to the fluidity, there's the multiple selves. We have multiple personalities, but again, these personalities are not multiple in the sense that they are from the inside out, but rather the different situations, the different roles in which we find ourselves provide us those different senses of self. Who you are as a son or a daughter, who you are as a college student, who you are as a worker, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, so on, so on. So we all possess these different selves, and the self that is salient, the self that is kind of most active, is the self that's going to kind of dominate, our self view in that situation, and how we think about others and how we think about the world in general in those situations. So now we can look at what I can call, the dramatic self. And so a lot of people, when looking at some of your questions from earlier in the semester, a lot of you talked about dramaturgy, and you kind of like this idea of the dramatic self. It's a very kind of simple idea in its essence, that basically we enter these roles and we play these roles out, just like actors step into different roles they play and they play them out. Although very kind of simple in essence, I think it is very insightful at the same time, because it really does allow us to see kind of what we do and why we do it in terms of a performance that we're giving in a certain role, and how we give different performances in the different roles we possess. So, here we can recognize that Goffman is extending the I and me that we talked about with George Herbert Mead. Basically, the part that we play is the me, and how we play that part, the performance of the part, represents the I. So Goffman kind of concentrates on the I and me, but again, more of the performative aspect of the self and the behavior that coincides the self that is most salient, that is most active. So, here I'm kind of, reorganizing the chapter a little bit, because this is how I think about Goffman. Basically, he says, when we enter a social situation, we also enter social roles. So the situation is kind of the larger part. In the situation, these roles exist. So when you enter the classroom, you enter the role of the student. When I enter the classroom, I enter the role of the professor. And we go into different situations. We enter different roles. So again, like I mentioned before, I go home. In the home situation, I now become the husband. When you go to work, you're no longer the student, you are now the worker. So the situation in which you find yourself provides you the role, and every role comes with a different script. And so we say there's an accompanying script in terms of, as a worker, this is what you're supposed to be doing. As a husband, this is what you're supposed to be doing. as a teacher, as a student. So every role comes with a script. And just like if you would, go into the theater, or if you go into the movies, the parts that you play, you don't just make them up as you go. Rather, the parts that you play have a script that comes with it. And so we perform the roles according to the scripts. And again, we can't have our own personal spins, like Mead believed we have free will, we have agency. So although that you're in the same role as somebody else, you can perform the role differently and still kind of maintain the responsibilities attached to that role. So again, I always like to say that you have a lot of different teachers all performing the same role, but they all perform it differently according to their own little spin, their own little fashion. And so the performance is, bigger than the behavior itself, Goffman says. We look at the settings we put up. We look at the appearances we project in terms of kind of clothing. The manner kind of gets into the different moods. Do we try to be humorous? Do we try to be serious? Um, so again, all these things kind of come with it. I just like, if you get directions to play a certain character, the character is supposed to be funny, supposed to be serious, supposed to be childlike. He's supposed to wear certain things. She's supposed to kind of decorate, her home in certain ways. And so, the performance is the behavior, but there's a lot of other pieces that come with it. And again, just going back to the analogy, it's like a movie, like a theater. Every theater, every movie kind of has the larger settings involved, and then everything else that comes with it. The behavior, the manners attached to the behavior, and kind of the appearance as well in terms of what a person wears, a costume per se. And so we're trying to kind of get into the heads of other people, an impression that we want them to have of us. So if I want my students to think that I'm a serious instructor, then I try to come across seriously to create that impression. If I want my students to think of me as somebody who's very friendly, then I come across more in the friendly manner. So again, you know, I'll say this on a different slide. Sometimes we give off these impressions, although they may not be true. I may come across as serious, but really I'm not that serious. I may come across as friendly, but I'm not that friendly. Students often will project kind of a front that they're really involved in the class, when in actuality the students often la la land. But nevertheless, you try to nod your head and act like you're involved because you want to create the impression in the mind of the teacher that you are paying attention, that you're all kind of following along like you should be, as a student. And so the underlying performances, are based upon that impression management, but also trying to avoid that psychological tension that we talked about with Mead, and the idea of why we try to match our actions to expectations. Goffman says we try to minimize any tension emerging inside ourselves, but also in the situation as a whole. And so I'll get into that further in the next slide. So because we're trying to create impressions in the minds of other people. Basically, we're trying to manipulate people to kind of think of us, see us in certain ways, and we're trying to avoid any tension from emerging in ourselves and in the situation as a whole. Goffman believes that a lot of human behavior, a lot of these performances we give, are insincere, meaning that we don't really kind of feel that way, although we come across as we do. And so we set up an office on campus and much differently than we set up an office in our home, because we want the office campus to project a certain image of ourselves to our students. We appear in certain ways, so I dress in certain ways when I'm in the classroom that I wouldn't normally dress at home. And so, just right now, I switch shirts. I had on, hoodie, kind of long sleeve sweatshirt. And then to project a different image of myself to students, I switched to a more formal like shirt. So, if I just got to pick and choose, what I was going to wear, I'd probably stick in the hoodie, which is more comfortable. But because I'm trying to project, a certain appearance to you, then I have to kind of put on the proper costume to get that projection across. And so again, all these things, Goffman argues that often are insincere. Yeah, we really don't want to address in those ways. Our office would look differently if we could allow it to look differently. The actions, the feelings are sometimes insincere actions and feelings. They're not reflecting who we really are, who we really, what we really feel like, but how we're kind of supposed to be, how we're supposed to feel in these given situations. And so, it's kind of, Goffman believes that we're con artists. We're trying to con people to kind of believe certain things um, that are not really true or not really sincere. But Goffman kind of does a little spin on this. He says we con people not because we're liars or we're trying to be bad. We con people because actually we're trying to be good. We're trying to maintain kind of smooth situations. We're trying to maintain kind of smooth, peaceful senses of self. So, for example, if a student asks me a question that could be easily answered by looking at the syllabus, maybe my first reaction is to say, "Have you read your syllabus? Did you look at the syllabus? It's right there." But I won't do that because if I came out kind of confrontational, I'd create kind of an awkward situation. The student would feel maybe a little bit embarrassed. The class as a whole would get a little bit awkward. So I try to minimize the creation of that individual or social tension by, kind of not saying, look at the damn syllabus, but rather saying, oh, my office hours are Monday, Tuesday, So by kind of being a little bit insincere and not really saying what I wanted to say, I keep the situation smooth as possible and I minimize the psychological tension from emerging. And the same thing when students kind of act certain ways towards me. They'll nod their heads and stuff like that because if they start to look around and not pay attention, then again that situation could become awkward. Where hey, are you paying attention? And then I call one student out, and the whole class gets a little bit weird and awkward. So I look at other situations when people ask you how are you doing. Typically you give the same response no matter how you really feel. Oh, I'm doing good. Thank you for asking. And so perhaps you're not doing well, but again, if you tell the person actually I'm having a bad day, then the whole kind of interaction gets a little bit awkward. So just to keep the interaction smooth as possible, to minimize any tension from emerging, then we kind of just do what we're supposed to do. When people ask you how you really feel, often they don't really care how you're really feeling or not. They're just asking because it's the polite thing to do. And sometimes when we respond to those questions, we're not really sincere in our response. But again, we kind of lie sometimes because we just want the interaction to go smoothly as possible. Smoothly compared to the alternatives, if you simply don't ask somebody how they're feeling and it gets a little bit weird, or simply telling the person how you really feel. And that could be a kind of a awkward situation if somebody comes to you with, "Oh, I'm having the worst day of my life." Uh, You know, sorry, I really didn't care that much. So again, Goffman's saying that we're insincere sometimes, and not because we're bad people or liars. We're actually insincere because we're good people. We don't want to create tension in people. We don't want to create tension on a more social level. So now we can wrap up the chapter by looking at the idea of the postmodern self. So, there is some overlap in terms of what we talked about with Mead and Goffman, how, the postmodern self is very kind of multiple in nature. And here, this is kind of connected to the new history in which we're living. So the postmodern self, again, is kind of a historical self. And that a lot of people say begins to emerge in the late 1970s through today. So what's different today compared to before the mid 1970s is life is much quicker. It speeds up, and so the speeding up of life is kind of one kind of angle where it's hard to kind of maintain kind of a coherent sense of self when we're always kind of juggling all these different selves at once. So I kind of get into how we're often switching our role in matters of seconds. So I'm at home, I'm interacting with my wife, yeah, kind of the husband role, the husband identity. And then, I start to respond to emails where I have to switch identities into the instructor, the professor, and then I kind of go from my emails to fantasy football, and there I'm kind of more the consumer, the sport fan. So within a matter of seconds. That can be kind of playing out, thinking in three different senses of self, the husband, the professor, the fan. And so, without the technology that kind of speeds up all this, the communication through email, the accessing information on the internet, then this simply kind of wouldn't be possible. So the same thing kind of in a classroom setting today. If you have your smartphone technology, he can be the student, but then you're responding to text messages to family members where you're going to be the daughter or the son, responding to text messages from friends where you become the friend. So within the classroom, in the past, without the technology, you had to wait. So time was kind of slower in a sense. You had to wait till class was over to go see your friends, to be the friend. You had to go wait to, talk to your parents on the phone, on a landline, or simply go home to see a family member. And so again, today we can do all these things at once, which makes kind of maintaining kind of a coherent identity more problematic compared to the past where we had the time to build that identity. And so another kind of angle here is that in our history today, we have a lot of kind of short-term occupations, short-term work that we do compared to the past, where basically often people would enter a job, kind of stay within that same job. Now they may kind of move around a little bit, but the job itself doesn't really change dramatically. And often you work in the same place, whether it be the same school, the same factory, the same mill. You would work in the same place. You would live in the same place. And that allows you to build this kind of identity connected to your work because the work is basically the same, to connected to where you live because you're living in the same place. But today, basically it's more common for people to have multiple short-term jobs. So people switch jobs more often today compared to the past. So when you're always kind of moving around job-wise, it's hard to build a coherent identity connected to your job. And often the job itself kind of switches dramatically. You're doing one thing and then what you're doing may be related a little bit. There's some overlap, but it's not a kind of a vertical kind of connection, more kind of horizontal movement going on. And often these job movements come with movements of physical location. So you're moving from place to place. So it's hard to identify with the community if you're always switching jobs. It's hard to identify with community if you're always moving from one location to another. So again, we have kind of these kind of short-term selves compared to more long-term sustained selves. And it's based upon the new histories in which we live, such as the technology, such as our new economy that kind of promotes this constant kind of movement of job, movement of physical location. And so what happens if you can't be connected to your communities anymore? If it's difficult to maintain kind of this coherent sense of self, what do you do to kind of find order, to find control over self? Remember we talked about the idea of self-efficacy, feeling like you're in control. So a lot of the post-Lano theorists believe to substitute the connections to place, what we do, um, whether it be workplace or just kind of place where you live, we substitute our consumption practices. So we connect to the brands that we buy, whether it be our clothing, our technology, cars that we drive, what you eat and what you drink. So you start to build identities in relation to no longer communities, but identities in relations to product. So this is kind of twofold. When you purchase products, you feel like you're in control compared to kind of in today's economy. There's a lot more anxiety, a lot more instability. So you don't feel in control as much in the job market because things change so quickly. You may be in and out of jobs before you know it. But when you're purchasing products, you're in control. You're making that decision to buy something or not buy it. And so, in addition to kind of feeling in control through the consumption, the consumption basically doesn't go anywhere. You're going to have those products, and you can kind of keep them with you, no matter if you're moving from one job to another or moving from one place to another. You still have those products. So, kind of replacing kind of connections to communities, whether it be work or community as a place. We're looking at connections to our consumption. And again, this reflects our new kind of history in which we live, where we can't connect to place as strongly as we did in the past. We can't connect to work as strongly as we did in the past. So now we turn our attention to connecting to products because those products we take with us and we're in control of the purchasing activity. We're in control of what we buy, what we don't. So it makes us feel kind of strong, and thus we can feel a coherent sense of self through the consumption. So interesting kind of ways of looking at who we are today compared to the past. And we'll stop that there for today. But I always like to say, and these are themes that we're kind of starting from the bottom up. So we'll come back to these different roles, these different senses of self as we move forward throughout the book.